Good afternoon. I'm Martin Chapman. I'm curator of European decorative arts and sculpture here at the Legion of Honor as part of the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. And it's a pleasure this afternoon to introduce our speaker, Christine Gervais, from the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. And I have to say straight away that it's Christine's extraordinary abilities that have really brought this exhibition to us in San Francisco. Her tenacity in choosing the most extraordinary works of art, working with Lord Cholmondeley to craft the exhibition that I hope you've all had a chance to see before this lecture today. Christine is Associate Curator for Decorative Arts at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston and also at Rienzi. She holds a BA in History from Trinity University, an MA in American Studies at from George Washington University, and an MPhil with distinction in the History of Art from the University of Glasgow in Scotland. She joined the staff of the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston in 2002. There, she is responsible for the acquisition, research, and exhibition of pre-1900 decorative arts objects, and she has curated several exhibitions, including their first exhibition on portrait miniatures. And for our interest today, she has done an exhibition circa 1900 decorative arts at the turn of the century, English taste, the art of dining in the 18th century, and her most recent exhibition has been Pattern Repeat, Wallpaper Then and Now, as well, of course, as this touring show of Houghton Hall. So please join me in welcoming Christine Gervais.
First of all, I have to thank everybody in San Francisco. In particular, your director, Colin Bailey, and my marvelous colleagues, Martin Chapman and Maria Santangelo, who I can't tell you how gracious and elegant the reception we have had here. It's been very memorable for me. And so thank you very much for coming here to hear me speak about something that's very dear to my heart at this point. In particular, I appreciate having the invitation to come and speak here because the objects have left me. They left Houston, were packed up, and were brought here, and it was sort of a bittersweet moment for me. So this is sort of the longevity of working with this, so I very much appreciate it. I also had an interesting moment where I was leaving the Legion late one night this week, and the fog came up, as I'm sure you are all very aware of, and it has that unearthly moment. But it was very thought-provoking for me because it was very reminiscent of the very first time I went here to Houghton Hall, where I arrived in the evening and was driven up this driveway, and it was foggy and it was dark, and the very famous herd of all white deer came out of the fog. Yes. This is a place of real magic, and not unlike the Legion of Honor. The beginning of this exhibition, as everything with Houghton, begins with this man. This is Sir Robert Walpole, the first Earl of Orford, who was a true larger-than-life figure. He was known in his lifetime as the great man, a satirical term that referred to both his physical stature — he became famously obese later in life — and his political position. Walpole was born on August 26, 1676, at Houghton in Norfolk, England, which is just sort of northeast of London. His father, another Robert, was a prominent local landowner and member of Parliament. After his father's death in November 1700, he secured the political seat at King's Lynn in Norfolk, which he held for almost 40 years. So a sort of great eminence in a British political history. Walpole's rise to power was not without mishap, and he was found guilty of corruption and briefly imprisoned in the Tower of London in 1712, which I think at this period is probably a bit of a rite of passage for a politician. The accession of the Hanoverian king of George I in 1714 returned Walpole's party to power, and he was subsequently appointed First Lord of the Treasury and Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1715, and then again in 1721. By consolidating these two roles, Walpole amplified his authority, positioning himself to be regarded by history as Britain's first prime minister. And I'm showing you here him sort of young, thin, handsome, really at the beginning of this rise. This is by the painter Charles Gervais, no relation to me, from 1708. He doesn't really have any of the accoutrement of office that he will sort of bring upon himself later on, but this is the young, bright hope of politics. This strange piece of furniture is a chair that we believe he used while campaigning. So it is directly linked to him as the great politician. According to family tradition, this chair was used for him as he would go through towns while sort of doing the hustings for Parliament, which are, of course, very important and central to him as this figure that is involved in government. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu recalled in 1748 that it was a maxim of Sir Robert Walpole's that whoever expected advancement should appear much in public. That he used to say, whoever neglected the world would be neglected by it. Yes, so this is the key to him. This is the key to his power. As well as this lady. This is his beautiful first wife, Catherine Shorter, who he married in about 1700. And she was a very great beauty, but more importantly, an heiress in her own right. She was a granddaughter of one of the Lord Mayors of London, so came with a sort of large amount of cash. So something that I think a rising politician would need, a beautiful lady by his side and a lot of money to sort of fund where he wants to be in life. So the building began on Walpole's new country house, Houghton Hall, in 1722. The house was intended to be a magnificent testimony to his new position in government. His twice-yearly meetings, or what he called congresses, at Houghton were very rowdy gatherings of his political cronies. Lord Hervey described in a letter in 1731 the dual nature of the house. This is obviously after it has been built, and this is what we're looking at here. The ground floor was dedicated to fox hunters, hospitality, noise, dirt, and business. And the first floor was devoted to taste, expense, state, and parade. So even at that period, they were understanding that this architecture, this house, had multiple uses, had multiple meanings. And certainly as Sir Robert was going into the building of this house, he was pulling these threads apart and trying to figure out how this space would be used, particularly for advancement. We will never actually know how much Walpole actually spent on this extravagance because he later admitted that he burned all the bills incurred in it because he did not want history to know just how much he'd spent. I mean, it was an enormous amount of money, an embarrassing amount of money. And in fact, he will die £50,000 in debts, which, again, if you were to do the conversion, is something astronomical. So this is the monument to self. This is, in effect, a palace that he has created to sort of put his literal stamp on the world. The exhibition, as it was conceived, is really an attempt to bring this house, this actual real space that exists, to you, the public. So as you go through, there are sort of simulacrums of real spaces that are at Houghton, real rooms that are experiences at the house, so that you can feel, hopefully, at the time that you finish going through the exhibition, that you've perhaps been someplace that's not a gallery. That's the hope. And also, of course, we do hope that you will go here at some point on your travels. And here is the plan of the principal floor. So in a European fashion, you do, of course, have a ground floor, which, of course, is for the dirt and the noise and the fox hunting. And then the first floor, which this is the plan for, which is this very interesting circuit plan with the salon here, or the saloon, as it is now called, the stone hall, and then these suites of rooms that sort of circulate here. Certainly, as you enter here, which is where you would enter onto this floor, the more you move this way, or the more you move this way, the more you're moving towards more intimate spaces. And again, there's certainly a psychology of space in the way that these rooms are programmed. These rooms are bedchambers and dressing rooms, or the library and the picture cabinet. And here's Walpole's library, which I will unabashedly tell you is my favorite room in the house. This entire project has been a dream and something that all curators wish that they could do, which would be to work with collections that have this age and provenance. But this is the transportive room for me, where I suddenly felt that I'm in the 18th century. And at one point, I found myself seated at Sir Robert's desk, going through his books, trying to figure out what books were going to come to the exhibition, and it was mind-blowing. Anyway, but here we are in the library, which is a smaller room that you find at the corner of Houghton's southeastern tower. While it's situated on the grand story of this first floor, or piano nobile, it's with all the formal rooms, it's an intimate space that's really intended for reading and contemplation. Although satirized in his own time as a man preoccupied with hunting and drinking, Sir Robert Walpole was a highly cultivated and educated man. He attended the prestigious boys' school Eton and was considered a most excellent scholar. Walpole was also later admitted to King's College, Cambridge in 1696, but 2 years later he left due to the death that year of his eldest brother and unexpected inheritance of the Houghton estate. What makes this particularly interesting is that libraries during the late 17th and early 18th centuries were typically not like this. They were gatherings of books in what were called closets, or very small spaces. So this room, which was designed by a gentleman who I will speak at great length about, William Kent, is one of the first private English houses to have what I would consider real architectural pretensions. It really is an architecturally designed space intended for books. The room itself is outfitted floor to ceiling in very expensive mahogany. At this period of time in the 1730s, mahogany was still heavily taxed, was having to be imported from Cuba and the West Indies. Of course, in his position as Prime Minister, Sir Robert managed to get many taxes on luxury goods lowered, strangely just before he began building this house. And we believe actually ordered what was nearly a full boatload of mahogany. So it's a very distinctive wood. It would have been outrageous to see the use of it in the house at this period. This room is completely outfitted mahogany. As you go through the house, the door surrounds are mahogany, the banisters are mahogany, and at some points he goes a bit nuts and he starts gilding the mahogany. So again, the most outrageous sort of wealth on display. But here you have it being employed for books. So again, a real sort of richness about this space. It was very important to him and actually adjoins his bedroom. So it's not actually in here, but there's a door right here that goes straight into his private bedchamber. So this is a very interesting interstitial space between very public rooms and quite private rooms. So I think if you'd made it all the way through and end up in Sir Robert's library, you were someone pretty close to him, and to actually get into this space. The books really do reflect Walpole's genuine interests. They were classical literature, philosophy, poetry, natural history, and they're all present in the exhibition and obviously in the library. There's a vast range of architectural folios in English and in foreign languages. So very much a man of his time. This is really the beginning of the Age of Enlightenment, and he is a man who is a part of that. In 1728, the English writer Sir Matthew Decker will describe this as a room in which are many valuable books bound and so neatly and well placed that it makes a perfect picture. And it really is, because it's all about the way that the mahogany is being used to frame out the gilded spines of books. So in this, the very expensive mahogany is also secondary to the books. A really, really beautiful, I think, use of both things. But the library is really, I think, to me, even today, if you go to somebody's library, you get a better sense of their mind. So being able to look through these books, it is like looking at the mind of a sort of a real humanist, which I think is what I think you can categorize Sir Robert as being. But not to forget him as the sort of wily politician. There is this book that I found in the library, which is from the ominously named Committee of Secrecy, which he was the chair of in 1715. So he announced the intention prior to this of the ministers to find and punish those responsible for recent political intrigues surrounding the restoration of the Catholics to the throne through the man who's called the Old Pretender. He will have a son called the Young Pretender. They will never get the throne. So he convenes the secret committee with him as the chairman, and as a result of his findings, they actually manages to impeach 3 political rivals, again, a most wonderful politician, and also undermines the Stuart uprising, the Catholic uprising, which will actually happen at the end of the year. So actually quite an important political document, and again speaks to his position and how he's able to use it. And here we have him a little bit later in life, where he's put on a few pounds. It does happen to all of us. But I always think these are quite funny because you portraitists are always enormous flatterers. So I'm not quite sure what the reality probably was here. But he's visibly prosperous, we'll say that. And this is his daybed, which if I could flip it over, you would see the underpinnings on this are remarkable. It's very, very large. It's sort of, we had, again, I am from Texas, so we had one of our patrons say, it's like a double wide. It's very, very big, just to accommodate Sir Robert, I think, as I said, later in his lifetime. As I mentioned earlier, I really think that the building of Houghton is truly this sort of, it's a sort of personification of ego. So he begins to build it, and the first choice of architect was a man named James Gibbs, who Sir Robert had helped gain commissions for in designs of university buildings at Cambridge. He was an Italian-trained Scottish architect. And he continued to support Gibbs and sort of employs him to do the initial architectural work. But after 3 years, Walpole gets rid of him. I actually had an architectural historian say to me, yes, the story was always that when architects provided him with a bill, Sir Robert dismissed them. Again, he's probably not very good with money, but it does seem to come back as a sort of motif about him and money. So he gets rid of him, and he hires another gentleman named Colin Campbell, another Scot, to finish the house. It's unclear with this turnover exactly who did what, but the general thinking is that Colin Campbell stretched the facade to this 450-foot facade, and the windows, the fenestration, which are very specifically Italianate, are very likely his. However, this very Baroque-looking, they make the Houghton very distinctive. These sort of the turret towers were very likely the work of James Gibbs in their sort of Baroqueness. And it also, I think, speaks to Sir Robert that he was a patron who was very engaged. So I'm sure we know Colin Campbell tried to convince him to throw away everything James Gibbs had designed because they loathed each other. But I think Sir Robert said no, and so he kept the bits he liked. And so you end up with this. The name, however, that is most associated with Houghton is William Kent, the genius that is William Kent, who is the third and last architect designer for the house. Kent was a leading proponent of the Palladian architectural style in England and a pioneer in the creation of the informal English garden, although unfortunately he did not do the gardens at Houghton. He wasn't quite at that point in his career. Initially, Kent began his career as a decorative painter, a sort of ceiling painter, which he was probably not that bad at because he trained in Italy. However, his talent in this field was described by Horace Walpole, Sir Robert's son, as being below mediocrity. Horace Walpole is always good for an acid comment. So Kent turns increasingly to architecture and design. He designs furniture, interiors, becoming one of the earliest English architects to plan a house with a single unified design scheme. So these rooms after rooms that sort of hang together thematically really comes from him. Of course, he's looking to Italy as well. The weighty, gilded style of furniture and interiors that took his name, Kentian, was largely inspired by the richly decorated interiors of the palaces that Kent studied during his 10 years teaching and studying in Italy. So he was in Italy, and one of the things that he becomes quite good at is these young men who've been sent to Italy to get a bit of polish and taste. He takes them around and he shows them the great works of architecture and interiors. When he moves back to England, he has this ready-made pool of young men who sort of ask him to come and give me an interior like you showed me in Rome. And he was very good at this, and they called him Il Signore or Kentino, and he would pepper his language with bits of Italian. So you can just imagine how this would take place. So he ends up working with Sir Robert on this interior. He begins work at Houghton Hall in 1725, and it was to be one of his most important early commissions. Houghton Hall's extravagant design reflected the social and cultural aspirations of its owner, Sir Robert Walpole, the first prime minister as we now think of him. Kent's painted decorations, designs for carved wood, marble chimney surrounds, and furniture and silverwares were all intended to exist in harmony with Walpole's famous painting collection, which were shown in arrangements also designed by Kent. This is a very interesting sort of way to think about interiors, where the paintings were integral, not sort of something that came in afterwards. They were considered part of an overall scheme, a language of a room, and they were obviously much discussed and much planned between Sir Robert and William Kent, because Sir Robert even gave Kent access to the collections that were also in his London houses as they sort of planned what needed to go to Houghton. This room, the cabinet, which is a sort of interesting room to talk about because it's not at all as it would have been in Sir Robert's time. As the title would suggest, the cabinet was originally designed for this display of small, precious paintings, which we would call cabinet paintings. Beginning in the 15th century, wealthy collectors of art would keep beautifully finished paintings in a cabinet, a relatively small private room to which only the most intimate friends and family would be admitted. And as I said earlier, in looking at that plan of the first floor of the house, if you have the library, this is diametrically opposite to the library and it exists in a similar kind of private public space. So that's sort of what's happening in this room. But the house inventories from the time of Sir Robert show that he hung 51 of his smaller pictures on the cabinets, at that point, green velvet covered walls. But the velvet hangings, likely bruised from the paintings and the frames, were removed after the sale of the picture collection to Catherine the Great of Russia in 1779. This is quite a famous moment in the history of Houghton. Sir Robert's collection was quite well known during his lifetime and was considered to be a sort of treasure in England due to inheritance and debts. His grandson will actually sell the collection to Catherine the Great, and so off they go. The room in which this is most visibly an issue is this room. So as you view it today, you really just have this it has had to undergo much change. So you get this very elegant result of the generations that have lived at Houghton, who've sort of left their imprint in this room. The bed is sort of Chinese embroideries, which was a christening present to Sir Robert Walpole's grandson from his godparents, King George II and Queen Caroline. And it was not actually, it's made for a child, but it was never actually, we think, used by him. It was just stuck up in the attics. The attics at Houghton are remarkable things, if you can imagine sort of all the leavings of centuries of the family. But I think it migrates down to this room in the late 19th, early 20th century, mostly because of the wallpaper. So what happens, of course, is the green velvet wallpaper. I can only imagine what to look at these ghosts of where pictures used to be must have been incredibly upsetting. So they remove it and get this wallpaper, which is Chinese export wallpaper, hand printed with blocks, and then also has these hand additions of birds and butterflies. They're just a most beautiful wallpaper. And it's amazing to me how it survived. And in fact, in the exhibition, you'll see 3 extra rolls that they found in these previously mentioned attics that are in amazing condition. And in fact, I was working on the wallpaper show that I was working on last year, and David Chumley said to me, "Oh, we have some wallpaper. Would you be interested in wallpaper?" Of course I would be interested in wallpaper. We would all love to see this. And they are canvas backed because they've to survive ocean voyages. And so they're rather hardy things, but completely changed the room from the way that they would have looked under Sir Robert. And now you're sort of in this chinoiserie fantasy. Also, they've moved in japanned and lacquered Orientalist pieces, some of which belong to Sir Robert. Oh, sorry, here's a bit more of that wallpaper. And it's interesting, you'll see this one, I'm sorry, the background, that is us actually having them lying down on the floor of the saloon because they are quite big, and the room is quite big, so we could actually look at them. But you can sort of see as well here one of the details. I told this story to somebody the other day. When we opened this exhibition in Houston, Lord Chumley went up to the wallpaper and said, "I had no idea these were gilded," because the light in the house, which has preserved them, is not particularly good to see by. So again, one of the great things about this exhibition, also particularly here in San Francisco, is the beautiful lighting that we're able to, that is being shone on these objects. As I mentioned, these other items have been moved into the room, including the japanned pieces that Sir Robert had collected. And of course, this is fake lacquer work, japanning meaning that they've sort of blackened up the wood and then taken gold paint and added it on to achieve lacquer. But in Europe, of course, they didn't have what was necessary to make proper lacquer. Sir Robert collected it, as did Sir Philip Sassoon at the beginning of the 20th century. Philip Sassoon was the brother of the 5th Marchioness of Chumley, and when he passes away, his estate goes to his sister, who is living at Houghton. And it's a massive influx of masterpieces of art that come in the 1930s. And it includes many wonderful pieces of lacquer. But what you end up with, and you look at the cabinet, you have just these amazing visible layers of patronage, inheritance, and outright extravagance, which are really what make Houghton the place it is today, and in essence are what we tried to do with this exhibition, is just to sort of give you a sense of the many people who've lived in the house and the sort of legacy that they've left to it. The Marble Parlour is interesting. It's the Marble Parlour, it's always been called that, but in essence, it is a dining room. But the concept of a sort of real formal eating room, a room to eat in, was a very new development in England at the beginning of the 18th century. Prior to this, and this is actually considered to be the first proper dining room in England, you would have had dining set up as a sort of real movable feast. In a hall, in a bedroom, dining would be set up and then taken away. This room was always sort of meant for something as a place to eat in. I think it's very much how Sir Robert, a way for Sir Robert to actually sort of expand upon the camaraderie of the people who were coming to stay at the house. In fact, one of his guests related, and I think it seems there's a very gleeful tone to it, that when coming to and sitting in this room, we used to sit down to dinner, a little snug party of about 30 odd, up to the chin in beef, venison, geese, turkeys, etc., and generally over the chin in claret, strong beer, and punch. So that gives you a sense of what exactly was happening in this room. Because again, you have all of these politicians who are coming up for 2 weeks to hunt with Sir Robert, but that's not all that was happening. Of course, they were probably also figuring out the politics that for the next year or the next 6 months as they had their little sort of conclave. It was also the last room on the state floor to be finished, and it features one of William Kent's most remarkable design schemes. The total interior decoration is dedicated to Bacchus, the Roman god of wine and feasting. Grapevines and figures reveling with wine appear on the chimney piece, the mirrors, the door surrounds, and the ceiling of the room itself. And these are some pieces that would have been in there. The armchair at the top is from what's called the Eagle Suite, with these very interesting terminal points that are eagle heads, meant to represent the god Jupiter, king of the gods. So again, you've got Bacchus cavorting on the ceiling and on the chimney piece, and then as you move down, you have these symbols of other gods. This is purposeful. This kind of mythological language was something that would be understood, but only really by men of learning and culture. So Sir Robert is placing himself as one of those and communicating to men that really I am one of you. Down on the bottom right is this wonderful loan to the exhibition from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Probably the earliest pieces of commissioned silver by Sir Robert, this pair of wine coolers from 1716, which actually bear his coat of arms as well as the lovely Catherine Shorter's coat of arms. And wine, I think, is something that is very much part of Sir Robert's story. While most of the bills, as I said earlier, were burnt, there is one that many of the ones that we do have were kept by the merchants. Sort of their invoices were kept. So there is a bill that actually shows how much wine was purchased by him in a year, which was totaled up to over £1,000 for a year's worth of Chateau Margaux, Chateau Lafite, great French wine, still great today. And he returned to the same wine merchant from whom he had bought the £1,000 worth over 6,000 bottles. Yes. So again, a great drinker. Sort of legendary parties were held at this house. The facade of the room that you're really meant to see as you walk in. So you would walk in going this way, and if you look to the left, this is what you see. Very interesting scheme, in particular these niches, which are very unusual and go back into space, and then there is a passageway that connects them with this door that leads out into a sort of service area. And this is really so servants can come in and serve and then sort of invisibly leave, because you never really want to see them. And then also these very odd buffets, which you can almost make out here, and perhaps better over here, over the cistern, a tiny, tiny tap. And the tiny, tiny tap was either for water, because they did have a form of early plumbing in the house, or the family story has always been that it was for the specially brewed, home-brewed beer that he would have on tap to serve to people, which I would totally believe. The whole room is actually done in marble, not fabric, which is something that, of course, you will see as you move further, because fabric holds food smells, and nothing was more detestable to them than the smell of food. So you get this very Italianate marble effect throughout the whole room. As I think is shown even better than it was in Houston, I think I have to compliment the San Francisco installation. The Stone Hall is really the first room that you should see. I think it's beautiful the way that you enter the exhibition. It's truly how you experience that floor at Houghton. The Stone Hall is within the intended sequence of the house, the first room that you enter on the state floor. You come up a majestic set of steps, and you walk into this space. It is a spectacular 40-foot cube, and the room was created as an homage to the glories of classical Rome and truly aimed to place Walpole within its direct lineage. It's decorated in very subtle white gray, and you can just see, hopefully, a teeny bit of the pale blue up here. So it's all very, very stark, but I think quite a thoughtful space. In particular, if you look down here, these benches, which are really the first things that you see in the exhibition. And this is really all about the genius of William Kent. The benches, as designed by him, were very thoughtfully made, in that he knew that he needed to accommodate pieces of Sir Robert's famous collection of antiquities. He had a lot of antique busts that were Roman. And if within the space, I think there are something like 16 of them, and you see one of them here. So he knows he has to accommodate these, and so he creates this kind of plinth. So instead of just having a bench that goes like this, he notches out the back, so that when you walk into this stark white space, your eye is immediately drawn to really the only point of warmth, which is the mahogany, also the first time you really encounter the mahogany. And then your eye goes up to the bust, or if you look at the bust, your eye goes down. It's a beautiful manipulation of space and a composed thing, with these three pieces being integral to each other. When we were doing the exhibition, one of the reasons why we wanted to do the photo murals really came from this, because if we just showed you these brown benches, every single person in this room would walk right past them. They are brown, they are benches. But within the context of the space in which they were created, they are remarkable. And I think really speak to the thoughtfulness that you encounter every minute that you walk through this floor of Houghton. And I just think it's just a wonderful example of Kent. And then you have things like this, which is right over the fireplace in the middle of the room, which is, again, reinforcing Walpole's status as well as his aspirations. Very significant, this particular bust, which is by John Michael Riesbrack, the famous sculptor who did many of the fireplace and a lot of sculptural work at Houghton. And here you have a bust of him, by him, of Sir Robert, where he is showing himself in a toga with short cropped hair, and as if he himself, so he's the prime minister, but he's showing himself as a sort of Roman senator. He's showing himself as a sort of new Roman, as if there is this analogy to be drawn between his politics and the great civic glories of Rome, and that's what he's going to bring to England. So it's just a sort of minor statement. I think it's quite interesting. So, and also, it's rather funny because the bust is above everything else in the room. So he puts himself exactly where you would think he would. Directly adjacent to the room I've just shown you is this warm, over-the-top, gilded space. So you can just see here through this door, this is the stone hall from which you've just come, and you walk into this. Again, I think a remarkable juxtaposition on the part of William Kent to put these two interior schemes just next to each other and truly at the heart of the house. So two very significant statements being made. The saloon is really the largest and most splendid of the rooms at Houghton, and it is the visual crescendo of everything that William Kent does at the house. It's very warm, it's very luxurious, and it's as I said, in direct contrast to what I find can be quite stark in the stone hall. It's truly an interpretation on his part of the magnificent Baroque palaces that had been seen in Italy when Kent had studied there, and in a very specific, again, unified decorative scheme based on Roman mythology, and this one is very, very programmed. And truly aims to present Walpole as a man of culture and learning, and by making the room dedicated to Apollo, god of the arts, and Venus, the goddess of beauty. And having looked at this room, or the sort of facsimile of this room that we had in the exhibition, I find it fascinating because really what you do is you move from this, which is the ceiling, called the Apollo ceiling, and you have Apollo and his chariot of the sun. And so he is the sky, in essence. He is the sort of the heavens. And as you move through the room, you end up moving downwards towards Venus, the goddess of the sea. So you move from the sky to the sea. Very, very beautiful transition. And here are some of the sort of those Venus attributes in this beautiful suite of furniture that Kent has designed specifically for the space. So as I mentioned, you have the Apollo on the ceiling, then you move down past and this is the room where he's gilded the mahogany, past the door surround, which has masks of Venus and the shells, which are also her attributes. And then you move down to the actual furniture where you again have masks of Venus and shells, and again, sort of fish scale. So it's a very beautiful sort of experience and you're meant to be standing there and deciphering these things as you look at the space. The saloon was the first room at Houghton to display this very ornate gilding and to have fabric on the walls. And it's a very specific survival to Houghton to have this fabric that still exists. They are the original crimson silk velvet, or what's called cafoy, which dates from 1730. This fabric has existed and has remained in very, very good condition since it was installed. It was very expensive in its day and was supplied to Kent by a man named Thomas Roberts, who was a chairmaker to the king. It's used on the wall, so you can see it here. and then it's used on all the furniture, and again, all original. This, which is, if you've been to many English country houses, it's always replacement fabric. It's one of those things that is so completely fragile, it just doesn't last. But Houghton does have a really interesting story of textiles that have, defied the odds and have lasted. One of the reasons why that happens has to do with who inherits it. So I'm showing you here a portrait of the gentleman who will go on to become the first Marquis of Cholmondeley. This portrait is from 1780. So what actually happens, and it can get a bit confusing, thankfully in the exhibition there is a family tree, because there's lots of sort of Georges and things. But what happens is Sir Robert Walpole dies, and his eldest son inherits, but doesn't last, more than 5 or 6 years. So then it passes to his son, who is the gentleman he is the third Earl of Orford. This is not the person that you would want to have inherit a house and this collection. He was a notorious gambler, a bit of a sort of wastrel, and also legitimately prone to mental illness throughout his life. He lost things in bets. Most famously, the staircase to the house. He actually lost in a gambling bet to a gentleman who was building his own house and needed the stonework. And then I think what is most egregious, he actually also had to pay to have it removed for the gentleman. And so, these are the kinds of things that hhappened. But most famously, he is the person who will sell the picture collection in 1779. So a bit of as I said, not the person that you want to have inherit this house. When he dies, will actually be succeeded by his great uncle, Horace Walpole, the youngest son of Sir Robert, who has no idea that he's going to inherit, is slightly appalled that he's inherited this house, because it is not what it was. It is not what he had helped his father to build. And he actually, there are some very sad letters from him where he talks about the mortifying ruin of Houghton, which he has inherited. And once he inherits, he actually never goes back to the house. He can't bear it. It's quite a sad story. But before he dies, he also manages to secure the inheritance, because there is a problem in that all the Walpole cousins have come out of the woodwork, because Horace Walpole is not married and has no children. So who will inherit? And so there is a legal case, there are legal proceedings, but he manages to actually have the grandson of his sister inherit. And here is his sister, Lady Mary Walpole, who marries a man named Cholmondeley. And here he is here. So this is the moment where the name will change in the inheritance from Walpole to Cholmondeley, although the present Marquis of Cholmondeley is in fact a direct descendant of Sir Robert Walpole. So they have lived in this house since it was built by Sir Robert. But here in this portrait, which is a marvelous portrait by the always funny William Hogarth, where you have the family, the adults here, and then right about here, things start to descend into chaos as the children take over. I really always enjoy this dog cowering in the corner, as if knowing something terrible is about to happen. But this gentleman here, this young boy, will be the father of this gentleman. So that is how the inheritance happens. And so by 1797, when he inherits, he's inherited a sort of a house that is not what it was, but he doesn't damage it, and in fact adds quite a bit to it. Unfortunately, he also is in the process of building his own castle in Cheshire. And so while he owns Houghton, he and his family choose to live through most of the 19th century at Cholmondeley Castle in Cheshire. So what happens for Houghton is Houghton sort of becomes a bit of a sleeping beauty. It becomes a house that is sort of rented out. They do try and sell it a couple of times. They try and give it as a gift of state to the Duke of Wellington, who sort of goes, "No, thank you." White elephant. I don't really think so. They try and sell it to the royal family, who also decline, and instead buy the neighboring estate of Sandringham. So it just sort of exists. until the beginning of the 20th century, where a rather remarkable woman will come to the house. But for our purposes, what's interesting about that is that nobody strips the house. They don't update it. They don't sell things. They don't Victorianize it. And this is how things survived. This is in particular how these remarkable textiles survive. The tapestry dressing room is a very interesting room that really functioned as a sitting room during the time of Sir Robert, because there's a massive, important state bedchamber just beyond this, which is the famous green velvet shell bed in it. As with the bedchamber, it is hung wall-to-wall with 17th century tapestries, while the dressing room at Houghton features very famous weavings, which I'm showing you here, of the Stuart kings and queens. The tapestries that are actually in the exhibition here, traveling, are usually hung in a room on the state floor that remains private to the Cholmondeley family. So if you went to Houghton, you would never see them. But if you come to see them in San Francisco, that's the only really way that you will see them. These are very interesting tapestries done by an English factory. They're not continental, they're not Flemish, they're not French. They're by Mortlake, which was a factory just outside of London, which had a sort of royal patron and did remarkable work. And what's interesting about the Mortlake tapestries is they're not really that interested in showing you sort of a cornucopia with realistic flowers. They're not trying to give you that. Mortlake is very dramatic. They give you these theatrical scenes of people doing things. And they're very lively. And I was very gratified in Houston how people were transfixed by these tapestries, which we've never actually shown before. So it was quite an interesting experiment. The set that we're showing you here are 7 of an original set of 12 that are called the occupations of the month. So each one of them represents something that you would have done during that month of the year. And this is May, where apparently aristocratic people go hunting and courting. Also in this room is a throne. And it's not to say that every English country house has a throne, but this one does. That is because Houghton, the people who have owned Houghton have traditionally had the role of Lord Great Chamberlain, which is a hereditary role that they've actually had since the late 18th century. And this particular throne, which was designed by the marvelously named Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin, who was one of the architects of the Houses of Parliament. So what you see on the news, that marvelous building, he also designed many of the interiors and furniture for those interiors, including this from 1847. This was made for use in the House of Lords. It is the throne for the Prince of Wales. They also have at Houghton the consort's throne. This was actually given as a perquisite or a perk of one of the ancestors of the present Lord Cholmondeley actually performing his role in Parliament as the Lord Great Chamberlain. This has an interesting story. Every time I look at this, it makes me smile, because when we were actually at Houghton packing up, the Houses of Parliament have a deal that, yes, these can stay. They were given to the Cholmondeley family, and they stay at Houghton. But for the opening of Parliament every year, if either of these thrones is needed, they will send art handlers to pack them up and bring them to Parliament so that they can be used, in this case, by Prince Charles. And we'd actually been told we could have this one because Prince Charles never goes to the opening of Parliament, except for this year. Yes. So we were actually there. We had the crate ready to go, and the call came from the Houses of Parliament saying, "Oh, we need to have the throne." And someone came to tell me, and I thought, "Oh no, oh no." But thankfully, Lord Cholmondeley said, "Don't worry, I will call him and tell him he needs to sit someplace else." Which he did. And that is why we are very lucky to have this remarkable thing. And I was told, and I think he mentioned when he was walking through the exhibition here, that he saw Prince Charles recently, who said something about how is my throne? I hear it's in America. So And here we have again two more of these sort of signifiers of their role, their role within Parliament, and also their role that is, certainly is quite close to the royal family. On the left, I'm showing you here the uniform worn by the fourth Marquis of Cholmondeley in about 1901, 1902, definitely for the coronation of Edward VII, and then the coronet on the right, which will only be worn for coronation. So the picture gallery at Houghton was really always intended to be a separate room from the staterooms. You accessed it from across the saloon, so that red gilded room, down the outdoor steps when they still existed, and through the colonnade. And it was actually in a former sort of orangerie or greenhouse space. When Walpole retired from politics in 1742, the rest of his collection, which now needed a new place to be displayed, was moved to Houghton from number 10 Downing Street, then the official residence of the First Lord of the Treasury. And they needed a place for it. So this 73-foot room was installed with these very interesting clear-story windows. So they were top-lit, which is not something that they normally did in architecture for these kinds of spaces in England at the time. And everything was hung with red wool damask. And then you had double and triple picture hang. I mean, there are a lot of paintings in the Walpole collection. And this is a sort of very similar, I think, in feeling to what you would have had. But the many paintings were arranged symmetrically. It was just on a scale of something that you would not have necessarily seen. This picture, which is on loan, there are 3 pictures on loan in the exhibition from the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., are pictures that are from the original collection of Sir Robert, which, as I mentioned earlier, were sold to Russia in 1779, which again, Horace Walpole has a marvelous comment where he says he's despairing of the fact that they have been sold to her, because he did try and get them to be saved for the nation, but they were already sold. To Catherine the Great. And so Horace Walpole says, he's despairing, and he said they've been sold to Russia, where they will probably be burnt in a wooden palace at the first insurrection. He's probably not too far off, but they actually do survive. What's interesting is actually the picture gallery at Houghton will burn down about 10 years after the sale of the pictures. So if they had stayed, they would not have existed anymore. So that is one of the great ironies of Houghton. Several of the pictures, not several, but some of the pictures from the Catherine the Great collection, which would go on to form the core of the Hermitage picture collection. That is how fine Sir Robert's collection, the quality of it, did escape. Some in the 19th century, but in particular the ones I'm showing you here in the 20th century under Stalin. Stalin was looking around at the beginning of the 20th century for ways to make money, and one of the things he looked to were the art collections, and they're sort of sweet, sad stories of curators trying to convince him that this was really not a good Van Dyck, or this was really not a good Titian, so that he wouldn't sell them, but he did. But fortunately for us, several of them were bought by Andrew Mellon, who would then, of course, go on to leave his collection to the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. So this is to sort of give you a flavor of what Sir Robert's collection was. But almost from the moment that the pictures are sold, the family starts buying, even the third Earl of Orford, who buys this lovely portrait of these Norfolk family members, the Gurney family, since 1790, so rather early on. And as you go through the pictures in the exhibition, many of them will have provenance so that you can get a sense of who brought it into the collection. Because this is truly the story of how these collections are made. And it is the layering of generations that are happening sort of on the walls in front of you. The first Marquis of Cholmondeley, who bought this marvelous Van de Velde, this Dutch seascape, this marine painting. This portrait here of the 3 daughters of I always called her the illegitimate granddaughter of Sir Robert, but she was more properly referred to as the natural daughter of granddaughter of Sir Robert Walpole, which I find a much more elegant way to say it. And then these are her daughters, the Waldegrave sisters. Also, the pieces that enter the collection are really, as I mentioned earlier, Sir Philip Sassoon makes a significant difference in the house. he was particularly interested in 18th century French and English art. And so there are two Gainsboroughs in the show, which comes directly through from Houghton through Sir Philip Sassoon. And this is a remarkable self-portrait by Thomas Gainsborough of himself with a jaunty hat. And then it continues to this day. And so the 7th Marquis of Cholmondeley, David Cholmondeley, is continuing to buy and add to the collection. I mean, it's not to say that they've completely recovered from the sale in the 18th century, but they are trying to fill those holes and those gaps in the walls continually. Here we have a marvelous pre-Raphaelite by Edward Burne-Jones from the series on Sleeping Beauty. And you'll see throughout the show really, really fantastic pieces made by the Sèvres Porcelain Manufactory, the great French royal factory. And I have to show these because, as I've said to my colleagues, these are the pieces that I would identify of if the building was burning, this is what I would grab. Very, very rare. The Sèvres Manufactory only ever made 9 pairs of these according to their records. And at one point, Houghton had 3 of the pairs. Just enormous collections of Sèvres of such refinement. These are little potpourri in the shape of shells with little shell feet and little shell finials like they're going to scamper across the table. I love them. But the Cholmondeley family and the Walpole family, they are collecting Sèvres in the 18th century, and then also in the 20th century get the boon of the Rothschild connection, in that Sir Philip Sassoon and his sister Lady Sybil Sassoon were also Rothschilds through their mother. And so again, you were linked to a great, great collecting of a tradition of collecting art, and French art in particular, and these sorts of things will enter the collection. And so again, I just mentioned Sybil. So then brings us to the 20th century. And this is the story of Houghton is truly of a great English country house which has remained remarkably in private hands since the day it was built. But it's had to weather a lot of changes. When the Cholmondeley family inherit, as I mentioned, they already have another house. It happens, of course, to all of us, and that's what. And so I called it a Sleeping Beauty house, which it has been called. But what happens is this woman here on the left marries into the family. This is Lady Sybil Sassoon. She will marry the impossibly handsome man on the right, who was the Earl of Rock Savage when she marries him, and he will be called for the rest of his life Rock. So she marries Rock in 1913. The portrait on the left of her, it was actually a wedding gift from the great American expatriate painter John Singer Sargent, who was a dear friend of the family, of her family, for I think a good chunk of her life. And she is really the person who sparks the Renaissance of Houghton. She was, as I mentioned, the wife of the gentleman who will become the 5th Marquis. But she was born Sybil Sassoon and was descended from the prominent Rothschild Jewish banking dynasty. She was a friend to artists, musicians, politicians, academics. But in 1913, she marries into the highest of the British aristocracy. They make a very dashing couple. They were known to race their Bugatti cars. There are great pictures of them in these cars in front of Houghton. And they constantly were having these parties. You get a very sense of the sort of period of the very beginning of the 20th century, which she's so much a part of. And they move into Houghton in about 1918, 1919, and begin to redo the house. There's an extensive campaign of repair and restoration, and she becomes devoted to this house. It becomes truly her life's work. She will live in the house for over 70 years, and she repairs the roofs, she repairs the heating. And she also starts collecting things that she feels had escaped the collection or should have always been in the collection. So she becomes a marvelous caretaker for it. But the relationship between Houghton and the American artist John Singer Sargent really begins with the woman depicted in this painting, Lady Aileen de Rothschild Sassoon, who was the mother of Philip and Sybil, who will become the 5th Marchioness, and is the connection to the Rothschild family. The Rothschilds, enormously famous art collectors, and she herself was a patron of contemporary art and developed a very close relationship with Sargent. And here she is painted by him in 1907, which is just at the very end of where he is declaring himself. He declares himself, "I'm tired painting portraits. I will no longer do portraits. This is right at the end of that, and it's a wonderful grand manner portrait of her. The story always was that when this was shown at the 1907 Salon, the family members came up to him complaining that there was something wrong about the mouth. And he sort of sniffily replied, well, there's always something wrong about the mouth. You know, like, I can't please anybody or anybody all the time. Anyway, but she's in this remarkable, this fantastic sort of opera cloak designed by the House of Worth. And here you have the incredibly handsome, sort of brooding Philip Sassoon on the left, in a portrait by the Welsh painter Glyn Philpott, who's not terribly well known in America, but I think it's really one of the stars of the show, as he sort of seems to be coming out of this black background. Philip Sassoon was one of the great art collectors and patrons in London in the beginning of the 20th century. He used to have exhibitions, which if you look at the list of them now, they look like things that should have been at the National Gallery in London, but instead he was having them in his house, his massive house on Park Lane. He was doing retrospectives on Gainsborough, or just painting in the 18th century. These were really, I mean, he was a great eminence in art, and as a result of that, you get great art that he collected, which is now in the Houghton collection. But his relationship with Sargent, he was, again, a great patron of Sargent through his mother. And you get Sir Philip, who was actually stationed in France during World War I. He was the secretary to the Field Marshal Haig. But he's one of the people who convinces the British government to make John Singer Sargent a war artist. So they send this urbane, sophisticated artist to France, where he will paint some very, very interesting paintings. If you ever have a chance to go to the Imperial War Museum in London, you should go. They're very moving pictures of soldiers, often at rest, or as much rest as they could perhaps find. Because Sargent was not that interested in the conflict. He was not that interested really in portraying war. He instead does things like the picture on the right, which is a ruined cathedral in Arras, where he's really showing the aftermath of war. He's really interested in how the light is playing on the sort of bits that are still left. And so we know that actually Philip Sassoon took him on the sketching trip to do the cathedral, and then later would actually buy the finished oil and add it to his collection. So again, a very intimate and intricate patron-artist relationship. And they knew many of the great and the good. There are two lovely things to me in the show, which one evening when I was at Houghton, Lord Cholmondeley brought out these autograph books that had belonged to his grandmother and his great-grandmother. I'd never seen anything quite like them before. They are books that guests would be asked to sort of leave an autograph or something in, or that they would bring with them when they were guests. So you get these things which if it was a musician, they would leave a bar of music. If it was a poet, they would write a stanza. Painters like Sargent or Paul Manship would just do sketches freehand in these documents. They've never been published, and it took a little bit to get them to be in the show, but I'm very glad that they were included. I'm showing you on the left one of the leaves from Lady Sybil's, which actually says, "Attend, an important autograph, George Bernard Shaw." Mm-hmm. And then on the right, one of my favorites, which is from Charlie Chaplin, who was a friend of Philip Sassoon, and we know actually was hosted by him several times. And he did come to Houghton. And the story that Lord Cholmondeley's told me is that whenever Chaplin came, it was always a problem because he was so hilarious that the servants would break faces. They would start to laugh, which of course you'd never want to have happen. But I think it's a sort of lovely sort of moment, if you sort of conjures up a particular sort of moment in time. And so this is what Houghton looked like at the turn of the century. This is the stone hall and its sort of most Downton Abbey moments, I think. So you can sort of picture aristocratic ladies sort of sitting here taking tea, but it bears very little resemblance to Sir Robert's vision of it. And you can sort of, it feels as if it's sort of imposed very much, that the room does not want to look like this. So you will end up with this, which is how it currently looks today. Or, one of my favorites, I took this picture with my phone. I don't know if you can see, but these are the toys. of the current Marquis's two sons. He has a pair of twins named Alexander and Oliver, and Zan and Ollie are everywhere. But I think it sort of very much speaks to the fact that this is a house that continues to live. It is a house that continues to look both to the past and the present. Literally, as you see this Sir Robert and William Kent interior with tricycles in it. And I think that that really does speak to the present Lord Cholmondeley's real gift, which is this looking forward as to what the house could be, what it should be, and in fact sending these treasures, which is a great leap of faith to send these things and pack them up and have them tour America. But we're very pleased to have had them, and I cannot tell you how pleased I am to see them here in San Francisco, where they look as good as they possibly could. Thank you very much.